Hello. Hi, everyone. I was going to say lovely to see you, but obviously I can't see any of you. But it is great to have you here, nonetheless. We're in February now, so we've powered through January, which felt like the longest January any of us has ever endured. We are clawing our way through this nightmare. We've got a great show today. Whether you are watching on the YouTube channel or you are now listening on the podcast, which we're very excited about, if we're going to boast, which I am, we're in the top 10 nationally, the number one news podcast. Thank you, everyone. If you're listening on the podcast, give it 5 stars. But it just helps. What are we talking about today? We're talking about Labour. We're talking about the big vision thing. What does Keir Starmer's Labour stand for? Now, the reason I think this is becoming a thing, and it is becoming a thing, there's chatter. There's chatter in the New Statesman, in the Guardian, in the Times. And what's interesting is people like me, I know, can be dismissed as whingy, recalcitrant lefties. Get over it. You know, you should go and find a ditch and die in it somewhere, that kind of thing. What's interesting is the sort of people who are naturally quite receptive, I would say, to Keir Starmer and his leadership of the Labour Party are privately actually quite uncomfortable, a lot of them, and publicly some of them are making that clear. I'm thinking of people like Raphael Bear, John Harris, Stephen Butcher in the New Statesman had an interesting piece about the kind of chatter about Starmer's leadership. And I suppose what people are talking about is, what does the leadership stand for? What's its direction? What's its vision? The polling at the moment, you know, and we'll talk, I've got a brilliant pollster on to talk about this. Labour have, we should be clear, Keir Starmer inherited, by any fair assessment, a pretty bleak situation. Labour, whatever your reasons for Labour getting a shellacking in 2019, it was a shellacking. That's quite an American term, bear with me. And there was a huge polling lead for the Tories, and that was clawed back. You could say on the flip side, this is a national emergency with one of the worst death rates on the face of the earth, apart from Belgium and Slovenia. And Labour's polling is actually back to where it was under Corbyn between June 2017 and January 2019. Keir Starmer's ratings are the best of a leader of the Labour Party for over a decade. They are going in one direction, and that is south. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, has he, you know, in terms of, is there a clear vision? Is it a case they're kind of trying to present themselves as competent and then get a hearing and then they can talk about their policies? Or is there just nothing there? We've got a lot to talk about. We've got some great guests. Just some housekeeping first. If you're watching this on YouTube, actually, if you're not watching it on YouTube, please click through to YouTube. It just helps the show. Give us a like. That helps the video. It means more people come and watch it. Please subscribe. Very chuffed that over 160,000 people have now subscribed. But you can be another one. And click on the notification bell. Those who are supporting us on Patreon to make this possible as we expand our media empire, thank you very much. For those who aren't, it's patreon.com/OwenJones84. If you want to support the show and put questions to our expert guests, use Super Chat. There's a little $sign below, and you can, whatever you want, and I will put your questions to our expert set of guests. Now, we're going to kick off with, we like on the show to stick to the facts. I obviously have a perspective I'm very open about, but facts are extremely important. So we need a reality check. And we've got a great guest to talk that over, who is a fantastic pollster with Opinion, Chris Curtis. Chris, come on in. Hello.
Hey, evening, Owen. How's it going?
Very, very well. Very well. How are you? How are you getting through this? How are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, you just got to try and keep being optimistic, don't you? I mean, I genuinely didn't find last year too awful, but now I'm really starting to struggle. I'm dying to be back at the pub again.
It sucks, doesn't it? That first pint, I remember the first lockdown. It was just the image. There was this video that went viral of a nice pint, a solitary pint with "Nothing Compares to You" by Sinead O'Connor blaring in the background. I think we're all at that stage. Okay, look, I'm going to start. I just want to kick off with a really interesting thread you did based on some recent polling. Let's just have a look at what you said in that thread. So basically, you talked about a 3-point lead the Tories had, which was a shift from the previous poll, but in line with what was happening elsewhere. Voting intention being stubbornly bouncing around neck and neck since last summer. However, you put in big letters. You pointed out that his approval rating has been declining fairly consistently. and that's gone down to +9, his joint lowest yet. And obviously, he did start from a very high level, and we should make that clear. And then finally, what you noted was actually his approval rating had particularly declined amongst 2019 Labour voters. Actually, his net plus amongst 2019 Labour voters had more than halved. So firstly, just to kick off, as I said, and it is important to be very fair about it, Keir Starmer does have the best rating still, doesn't he, of a leader of the Labour Party for over a decade?
Yeah, I mean, he currently has numbers that Ed Miliband would have dreamed of for almost all of his leadership, that Jeremy Corbyn would have dreamed of for almost all of his leadership. And I think at this stage, there's very little in the polls, really. And there's very little in Keir Starmer's numbers to say that he isn't popular enough to be Prime Minister. And I think the other thing, there's a few things to consider, I think, when looking at the numbers. The first is, yes, his numbers are declining. That's a bad thing. Nobody's going to argue it's good. But that kind of always happens. You almost always see a drop-off in popularity as an opposition leader's tenure goes on. It happened for Cameron, and Cameron still went on to be Prime Minister. It happened for Miliband, but Miliband didn't. So, to a certain extent, his numbers are just following that general trajectory. Another slightly more positive thing about arguably positive thing we'll see about Keir's numbers is actually they're a lot more bipartisan than you'd expect. So if you compare back to Miliband's numbers in the sort of his early period as leader of the opposition, and you compare them to Keir Starmer's a little bit less popular amongst people who voted Labour than Ed was, but he's a little bit more popular among Tories. Now, yeah, that means that he could lose voters on his left and gain voters on his right, and it cancels out. But I think what it means is that the Keir Starmer's potential voter coalition is probably a lot larger than Ed Miliband's ever was. So there's still a lot to do. The most important thing being, like, what vision does he set out to the country? Does he have one? Which we'll see over the sort of coming months. But at this stage, despite the decline, I don't think there's much to worry about in his current sort of level of popularity.
I mean, the fact that his polling has fallen, his approval rating has fallen amongst 2019 Labour voters, I suppose one school of thought would say they're in the bag. But I suppose the danger for Labour is that that theory has been tested to pretty grim destruction, first in Scotland and then in the Red Wall. And there is an issue that turnout is already the lowest amongst Labour voters traditionally. Labour finds it harder to get the voters out, not least now because there's a big age divide in voting, and older voters are far more motivated to vote than younger voters who now support the Labour Party in their highest numbers in the whole history of the Labour Party and democracy. So do you think that is an issue, that there is a fall in approval amongst Labour voters or people who voted Labour in 2019? And how would you explain that fall of enthusiasm?
Yeah, I do think it's a problem. I think this idea that Labour can just appeal to the centre ground and that will be fine and not care about its left flank is absolute nonsense. Ultimately, the Labour Party, the Labour Party has an incredibly difficult challenge to get into government next time round. It cannot be affording to lose voters anywhere. So yeah, it really does need to care about its left flank, and I think that's a serious concern. I also think that, though, that actually it's an easier problem for the party to solve. So actually sort of appealing to those conservative voters, those centre ground voters, peeling them away, making them sort of come back to the Labour Party or feel comfortable with the Labour Party is a lot harder challenge than on the left, and winning those voters back over. So while I think the Labour Party does, and Keir Starmer does need to care a lot more about those voters, I think that should also be a bit of an easier task. So as an example, I think one of the things, you're going to be talking about vision, one of the things the Labour Party needs to be setting out as it comes out of this pandemic is, firstly, the Tories, they weren't putting enough money into public services. That meant we weren't prepared to go into this pandemic. We need to make sure as a country that we're best prepared to fight the problems of the future, for example, climate change. And I think putting forward that vision, firstly, you can see how that would appeal to centre ground voters, but would also do a good job at covering that left flank among voters who currently don't feel great towards Keir Starmer. In
terms of that vision thing you talk about, I mean, we saw in my newspaper, my colleague Editor Chakraborty had a leaked strategy paper, which should be said was commissioned by an outside organisation. But one of the things it did suggest is what is cutting through is people don't know what Labour stands for, and it is getting something of a reputation for fence sitting. So do you think that is a problem that at the moment, you know, I suppose the least problem Jeremy Corbyn had was what, you know, not people not knowing what he stands for. I say that, but actually Brexit did complicate that a lot, to be fair. And actually the advantage Jeremy Corbyn had in 2017 election, which was say what you want about him, but he means what he says and he says what he means. And actually Brexit did wreak chaos with that. That aside, is there a problem that Labour at the moment, under Keir Starmer's leadership, people don't really know what it stands for?
Yeah, I mean, yes, yeah, I think that's true. I think one of the difficulties Keir Starmer has, and actually a lot of opposition leaders have, is that he's kind of got to hold the job for too long. So when you think back to Tony Blair, he came in unfortunate circumstances, but it meant that his time as opposition leader was shorter. It's also kind of true of Attlee, who was obviously in coalition with the government in his run-up, and also true of Wilson to a certain extent as well. My point being that actually it's a very, very long time to set out your vision. And what that can mean is that your vision can often become stale because you spend 2 years talking about it and then it's no longer relevant, or the Conservatives move into that space, or people get bored of it. So that by the time you get to an election, which is many years away, it's got a bit old and boring. So while I think it's true that Keir Starmer hasn't set out a vision yet, I'm not entirely convinced that's necessarily a bad thing. If he can go on to do that, and he's still got more than enough time to do so, then actually I think we could look back and say it was right for him to sort of hold back and wait, and not necessarily push too hard at the moment, and then his vision for the country to become out of date before he actually has to find election.
Finally, the pandemic. Now, there's been critics, myself included, but actually, let's be honest, people like Alistair Campbell months ago, not known as a raging lefty, who expressed his deep frustration with the failure of Labour to pin the pandemic on the Conservatives. And actually, if we look at what happened stateside in the US elections, the Democrats did succeed in pinning the pandemic failures on Donald Trump. And given it only took a 2% swing the other direction for Trump to stay president, that probably proved pretty critical. And the death rate in the United States is actually lower than it is in Britain. Senior Labour figures would say, and do say, it's all right for me, people like me, to, you know, I can be as aggro about the government to my heart's content. One of the worst death tolls on the face of the earth, the worst death rate overall, except for Slovenia and Belgium. But actually, a lot of the swing voters they want to win over think they're being too tough on the government. But I would say equally to that because they failed early on to have a narrative. So the Tories wove a narrative about the financial crash. Labour spent too much money. It was a myth, but it stuck. It was very effective. And Labour haven't got a story about why we ended up with one of the worst death rates on the face of the earth. And that's let a sense of, well, they could have, amongst the public, well, of course, they may have made mistakes, but they were dealt a very difficult hand. Wouldn't want to be in their shoes. Plus, a lot of them are blaming the public. That's what the polling shows. Do you think Labour have failed to pin the pandemic disaster on the government, and that's led people to basically blame the ne'er-do-wells down the road?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult always, even as a pollster, to sort of test the counterfactual. If Labour had been harder, would that have meant that people did then blame the government, or would it have meant people just got more upset with Labour? It's a very difficult balancing act, and I sort of don't envy them for having to negotiate their way through that. I think the main point, to be honest, isn't whether Labour's been too tough or not tough enough. It's the fact that the public have been overwhelmingly willing, politically speaking, to give the government the benefit of the doubt. Now, you know, that just seems to be what the data shows. I don't actually think Labour would have been able to have much of a difference on that. Just jumping back to your point on the financial crisis for a second, I actually think that what happened there was slightly different. It's not the fact that the way the Tories owned that crisis was by going, Labour, you just ruined, you've just caused a massive financial crash. People didn't really believe that. Actually, the way the Tories managed to come out of that crisis in such a good way is by telling a story about why the country wasn't prepared for that crisis in the first place. Labour overspent. Labour was spending too much money. They were, spending it on a load of rubbish that they didn't need, and that meant coming out of the crisis, the country was in a lot worse position to deal with it. And now we need to cut and we need to fix the roof while the sun is shining to prepare going forward. Actually, I think rather than necessarily, however upsetting it is for a lot of people, rather than trying to pin the blame on the Conservatives for different things during the crisis, particularly now most of it's going to be in hindsight, I actually think the better strategy for Labour is to tell a story about how the country wasn't prepared going into the crisis. For example, because we weren't investing enough in public services, to then say that the crisis was worse because of that, and to put forward a vision for how the Labour Party going forwards would change the country so we were always prepared for stuff going forwards, i.e. by putting in more public spending. So actually sort of do try and do what the Tories did in the financial crisis. But I think it's more having a vision about what Labour would have done differently going into it to prepare us for it, rather than necessarily sort of rehashing the arguments about how they handled it during the crisis.
Chris, been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us. And chin up, we'll have that cool pint in our hands. I'm
so excited.
I know it's the only thing make it all worthwhile, but we will get there. We will get there. All right, buddy. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and take care.
Well, have a good evening.
Cheers. That was great. Thank you so much again to Chris. So we're going to bring in now to, I would say, two of the creme de la creme of the Labour movement, excellent experts who both know the Labour Party inside out. Let's bring in Andrew Fisher, who's the former policy chief supremo of Jeremy Corbyn, and Sienna Rodgers, who is, of course, the editor of LabourList and who really should be hired by a national newspaper because she's way better than a lot of the lobby hacks, or all of them, or most of them. Sorry, I need to avoid getting in trouble. She's very good is what I'm trying to say. Hello to both of you. I want to go straight in. I'm going to flash up. We're going to just hear from Keir Starmer in January 2020. Let's have Keir Starmer from 2020 January. Let's hear what he has to say.
The fundamental shift in our policy from 2015 to 2017 and then to 2019 to a more radical politics was the right fundamental shift. Big issues like being a party of anti-austerity, being a party that wants to invest in our public services and in manufacturing. Really important shifts, and I'm very concerned that as we move forward, we don't either trash the last Labour government or trash the last 4 years.
Pretty clear there, I would say. I don't think much room for doubt. He did 10 pledges as well, which, for example, tax top 5% plus increased taxes on big business, abolish tuition fees, common ownership, slightly dodgy wording, gives him a bit of leeway, green industrial revolution, no illegal wars, free movement, that's definitely gone, by the way. But Andrew, has he kept to what he said there?
Not yet. I mean, I don't want to be overly critical because, like, he's also, I think it's worth pointing out, he's kind of had a pandemic to deal with from the second he became leader. You know, he became leader, I think, about a week after the first lockdown started. So suddenly setting out a kind of manifesto's worth of policy wouldn't have been the right time anyway. So I kind of give him a bit of leeway, and I think a lot of people did at the beginning. I think, you know, it's tough being leader of the opposition anyway in any circumstances. And coming into it during a pandemic is tough as well. But have we seen a vision yet? No, not really. Have we seen him kind of be consistent on the pandemic and have a consistent line on that? I mean, I thought it's probably his best moment really was kind of September, October, I think. So probably early October when the September minutes from the Sage came out. And he said, look, you've got to lock down. And then Boris Johnson belatedly did after saying, oh, no, I'm not panicking and all this sort of thing. And then he kind of saw the real numbers and did lock down. And that was good because he established himself as follow the science. And it bought into that kind of technocratic competence thing, which was very much part of his, his whole shtick, really, as a politician. So that worked. But then he kind of ignored the science in December and said, oh no, we must have the schools open. So that kind of blew that bit a bit again. And now he's kind of on this vaccine thing about teachers, which I'm not against vaccinating teachers. Obviously, they're going to be vaccinated like everyone else at some point. But why teachers? Why not supermarket workers who are in shops now facing people day in, day out, often without enough protection, aren't highly unionised and get better protection, get less protection because of that. Delivery drivers, you could go through a list, bus drivers and so on. So I also think there's a lot of, and your colleague Francis Ryan at The Guardian has done a really good piece in the last couple of days about the number of adults with learning disabilities that aren't high enough up the priority list and so on. So if you were going to criticise at this point, I would have gone on that. But so at the moment there's a lot of frustration, and I think there are also kind of mood music points coming out of other members of the shadow cabinet who seem to be indicating they are moving away from previous positions, and I think that worries a lot of people as well.
Sienna, what do you think? Do you think that was an authentic commitment, and how much do you think those policy commitments remain those of the Labour Party?
I think a lot of them, it remains to be seen, because this is stuff that he's going to be talking about closer in the run up to the 2024 election, assuming it happens then. He's intending, for instance, in terms of tax arrangements, that kind of stuff is going to come much later on. And that is understandable, I think, especially with the pandemic. Clearly, the freedom of movement one, though, that was immediately abandoned, because the pledge there was to defend freedom of movement as Brexit happens. And I mean, Brexit happens. There was no defense of freedom of movement. In fact, they didn't want to talk about Brexit at all, and certainly not free movement. And then obviously voted in favour of the Brexit deal. And then after that said there wouldn't be any renegotiation of the treaty, even if Labour did take power after the next election. So basically the freedom of movement one, that's gone. And it was gone immediately. So I think we could say that the 10 pledges aren't safe as a result, but we could also, it wouldn't be useful for the left of the party to say, oh, well, they're abandoned, let's forget about them. It's still useful for the people who agreed with those policies, even voted for him on the basis of those policies, to keep banging on about them, because that's a useful thing for them to do.
I mean, Sienna, what do you think at the moment about the whole vision thing? Do you think, I mean, some would say, senior Labour people would say, well, look, the big problem at the moment is a lot of the voters that Labour needs to win over aren't listening to us. And they're not listening because they think we're shambolic or we hate the country, etc., etc. And therefore, to get a hearing on anything, we have to do all of these things to show that we're serious and your grievances are being addressed, and then you'll listen to us on policies.
Yeah, that's totally the argument. So whenever you say, well, what's your commitment on this, or where's your vision, when are you going to start spelling out kind of more concrete policies, or a more coherent package of policies? Because there have been policies, actually. I think that's important to say, that I kind of, just before this event, I was trying to have a look at, trying to compile a list of policies. He's been talking about things like outlawing fire and rehire. I mean, there's the Constitutional Commission. We haven't seen much of that yet, but it's been launched. He launched a passionate defence of scrapping tuition fees at an event that I covered last week that really didn't get much pickup, because of course it's just maintaining a policy, so no one else reported on it. But members and people like Andrew certainly picked up on it. Talking about protecting leaseholders and taxpayers from cladding costs, free school meals, green recovery stuff, and loads of COVID policies, like being against the tier system, universal credit uplift, public sector pay freeze, hotel quarantining. There's tons there. There's tons, but it doesn't seem to have come together in a really clear way. And I think that actually, for me, is the problem. I actually think there has been a lot of policies. It's just that even Labour members who follow party announcements very, very closely haven't really noticed them. And that's clearly a problem with communication. I think with the government throughout the COVID crisis, a lot of the time people blame communication on the problems and actually their policy problems. I think with the Labour Party, it's the opposite, and it's communication problems. A lot of the time, to be frank, the communication is boring. You don't notice it because you're bored when they're communicating them. And I mean, that's something, fortunately, that can very easily be fixed if you want to fix it. But obviously, Keir Starmer, I mean, when he appointed his shadow cabinet, I kind of said it was a purge of, what did I say? It was a purge of the kind of most vocal people in the PLP. And actually, he brought in all the quietly competent people. That's what he was going for. So he kind of likes that style of communication, sort of, nuanced and sensible, and, conveying a sense of we're responsible people. And that's obviously part of, rebranding Labour and trying to go against some of the perceptions of the Corbyn era. But I think being a little bit more exciting wouldn't go amiss here.
Yeah, Andrew, someone, Alex Wentworth Wood, asks, where have all the Labour policies gone? And I suppose, if we're gonna, be very fair, for example, the other week, Keir Starmer did actually quite an eloquent defense of abolishing tuition fees. Do you think part of the problem is they don't have a clear vision to stitch policies together? So they might, and also no one, I bet you 99.99% of the population, including 99% of Labour voters or members, aren't even aware of him making those arguments. Is it communication? Is it a vision?
I think it is to an extent. I would also say Johnny Reynolds in the Shadow Work and Pensions brief has done a really good job of setting out policies. And actually, I've been quite heartened at how Labour hasn't kind of retracted on that, because that was actually the stickiest thing that we kind of moved on. Do you know what I mean? Because Labour under Ed Miliband, and it wasn't particularly Ed Miliband personally, but his Shadow Work and Pensions people had really stuck quite close to Ian Duncan Smith. And we saw obviously in the summer of 2015 how the PLP abstained on the welfare bill and so on, and we're making arguments about, well, maybe tax credits are a bit too much, and we have to listen to voters after the 2015 dropping. So the fact that Johnny Reynolds has done that, stuck quite well, actually gone a bit further, he said get rid of the savings limit, the universal credit, which helps people. Obviously, a lot of young people in London who are saving up, desperately trying to get a deposit, not just in London, actually everywhere, who therefore wouldn't be entitled to benefits because they've got savings they're trying to use to buy a house, now unemployed, and so on. So that's a really good policy. Also, people nearing pension age who are trying to supplement, frankly, occupational pensions by having a few savings, then won't be entitled to benefits. So it's a really good policy. But where's the campaign on it? It's not just the communication, it's a lack of campaigning around these issues, which I accept is harder during lockdown. But you've got online, people are online more than ever. You can use Facebook ads, you can use, all the other forms of social media to do this. You can still, talk about these things. You can still get articles placed in newspapers that tell stories around these issues. I don't think there's been enough of that. And the fire and rehire thing is a really good policy, which again wasn't our policy. Probably had other things in line that would have stopped that sort of thing happening. But it's a really clean way of doing it. Of course, it's difficult if you're going to talk about fire and rehire to do something that's worse than fire and rehire, which is fire without hire to several of your own staff during a pandemic. And I'm sure we'll come on to that. But that doesn't help your messaging. But they have done some policy stuff that's been all right. There's a defence, when he defended tuition fees in pretty similar language to how Jeremy Corbyn, defended scrapping tuition fees in pretty similar language to Jeremy Corbyn did. He also set out a fairly good case against austerity as well, and why we shouldn't go down that road. So again, there's signs. I'm not saying there aren't countervailing signs as well, but there are definitely signs to be more confident that Labour's not going to sink back into a kind of austerity light, tough on migrants, tough on welfare claimants. Perhaps less so on migrants, because I think Labour has been pretty quiet on that, and I think it's been quite disappointing how kind of silent they've been over the Jamaica deportation flights, over Black Lives Matter. They haven't criticised the police, even though you've got the head of the Met saying it doesn't have a problem with institutional racism, which kind of look at the stats, read the Lammy review that your own Shadow Justice Secretary now did in the Cameron era. I think there are some problems there, but I think there are some reasons to kind of have a more balanced view than perhaps some people have at this point.
Sienna, do you think, if we look back at the Corbyn era, which obviously, and Andrew was part of it, there was always this term, the project. That's how it was described, the project. There was a clear project for obviously the Labour Party, but also for the country as well. And similarly, New Labour did have a clear sense of this is what they were trying to do. Do you think they have a clear sense of their vision for the country, that what they want to actually do with power, kind of end destination that they're trying to get to?
I think if you ask a Labour MP, what is Starmer's project, they would say to be Prime Minister. They would say to win the next election. that is the focus of the leader's office at the moment. And obviously, a lot of people on the right will say that that wasn't the project of the Corbyn era, and that was the problem with the Corbyn era. Although I think in any era, actually, it's very silly to say that anyone in the Labour Party isn't absolutely desperate to win. So I think that's, often ridiculous and bad faith argument. But a lot of them will say it's good. That's his priority, but we need a little bit more. I mean, I think he started to sort of very, very tentatively shape some sort of vision. He's got this line that he comes out with a lot about making Britain the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. Now, I think Guido took the piss out of him recently because they said that, this line was used by Theresa May and it's been used by other politicians. But we don't quite know what the meaning of that is yet, but I think it does kind of evoke, cradle to grave kind of sentiment, the NHS, early years education, and protecting the elderly. And ironically, of course, that actually appeals to the middle section of the population in terms of age, because they have caring duties towards both of those kind of people. It sort of evokes family and pride in your country. And of course, Starmer has paired this with a huge emphasis on education. So he's been talking about not closing schools. I mean, I have given my opinion on that one. I don't think that was a good call to wait so long on that one, to resist what was actually inevitable. But he's been talking about the attainment gap and getting children online. He's very personally concerned with the fact that, so many children can't learn properly, or that there's a big gap in terms of pandemic learning. And they've appointed what they believe is their best media performer, which is Wes Streeting, to the role of Shadow Minister for Schools. So all of this is kind of starting to shape some sort of vision, but it just hasn't come together yet.
Who is, do you think, the Starmer faction? I mean, again, there was a clear Corbyn faction. There was a clear Blairite faction under his leadership. I mean, there are always people who will accommodate to the leadership faction at any given time. Not though in the Corbyn era, that was often not so much in many cases. But I mean, is there a clear kind of this is Starmer's people? I mean, when he stood on the leadership, one of his kind of promises, and we'll talk about internal factional stuff, was not to be, was to be unifying and to draw from all the different talents. And obviously he was positioned as a kind of soft left candidate. But is the soft left his actual base, or is it something else? Sienna. Oh, Andrew, you did go. Andrew, sorry, go for it. No, Andrew, go for it. You've got the floor.
I mean, I think, yes, that probably is his thing. And I think Sienna was right earlier when she said the shadow cabinet is very much appointed in his own image. They are his people, and they have been probably a little underpowered so far, although it's interesting to read in the press recently how some of them are saying we're not underpowered, we're just not allowed to get a word out. So there's obviously a bit of dissent even there within his own shadow cabinet. I'm not sure he has a very firm base, and it's interesting. I know you said we'll come on to the factional stuff, but Stephen Bush today or yesterday writing about how some of the Labour right, really, I suppose the new Labour wing, are beginning to be more critical of him. And we've seen, as you said, Alistair Campbell, but also Andrew Adonis being very critical of him on Twitter as well. So, the kind of Blairite fan club, coming out in force to be more critical of him, which is interesting, I think, that's happening already at such a stage. And it is, obviously 9 or 10 months in, that's the time normally for a coup against a leader who's been elected with a big mandate. So, maybe it's right, consistent at least. But I think the other thing I wanted to pick up on was what Sienna said about his phrase, make Britain the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. It's a really nice phrase, and I quite like it. But has he illustrated anything to add meaning to that yet? I think the answer is no. He hasn't talked about childcare or child poverty or education, really, except get the schools back all the time, which is becoming a bit obsessive. And he hasn't talked about social care, really, which I think is poor because it's a real issue at the moment in the middle of this pandemic. Care homes have been decimated by the under-resourcing and the lack of respect that's given to care workers. He hasn't talked really about pensions or retirement age or anything like that. He hasn't given us any meat, whereas I think if I look back at what we did, and we obviously got a lot wrong, had quite difficult start off as well, but our kind of core phrase, if you like, at this stage was austerity is a political choice, not an economic necessity. And it was an argument against austerity, and we underpinned that by arguing against cuts to welfare, some of which, in fact, billions of pounds of which we got a U-turn on. We talked about how corporation tax cuts were happening at the same time as they were cutting benefits and cutting funding into schools and so on. So we had that very kind of clear illustration of how we do, what we said, if you like, as our kind of only real mantra at this stage of the cycle, was illustrated, very clearly illustrated, very clearly backed up, and we got wins off the back of it. So I think there is a problem there, and I think we did take a while to transition into this is our positive thing. I guess for the many, not the few, was the positive thing, which then incorporated public ownership, redistributive taxation, ending austerity. They all fitted under that slogan of for the many, not the few. And I think that was something that you have to take time. You have to kind of put the negative of where they're going wrong and then put the positive. And he seems to have, bizarrely got the phrase of, it's a really nice phrase, about being the best country to grow up in, the best country to grow old in, but not really got anything to hang on it yet. And I worry, because I think, if you were an interviewer, you'd go, okay, what does that mean? And I'm not sure there is anything at this stage.
I mean, Sienna, just that point before I just bring in the flag stuff. Does he have is there a clear Starmerite faction within the Labour Party, in the Parliamentary Labour Party?
I mean, I guess if you had to say that he has a faction in the Labour Party, it would be the Fabian Society. That's what he's kind of very closely associated with. And there's a lot of Fabians appointed to the shadow cabinet. But obviously, it's a bit broader than that, because when he appointed his front bench, that's all the junior shadow ministers at first, actually it was quite a different story. And he started bringing in lots of kind of vocal critics of Corbyn and lots of people who are associated with the right of the party, people like Wes Streeting, who have since become far, far more prominent in terms of doing media rounds, but also people like Jess Phillips and Ali McGovern, although they have been quieter. People like Conor McGinn as well, who, is on the security brief. And obviously there's been that huge controversy over the Spy Cops bill. And I mean, I don't agree with Labour's stance on that. And I think that has been concerning to a lot of people. So, I mean, I think generally there has been this just incredibly risk-averse approach to policy. And it's reflected in the school stuff, it's reflected in the Spy Cops bill. And I think the leader's office often is underestimating the point of Keir as a person. His main appeal during the leadership election was actually that he kind of represents the establishment. People might find that depressing to hear, but he's a kind of an embodiment of how normal people can rise under the present system and make a success of themselves. That's his story. And also people think, he looks good in a suit. He looks like he belongs in number 10. He's professional. That's the kind of thing that I was hearing, at my own personal local party meeting, for instance, when people stood up and said why they were voting for him, that's the reason they gave. And this is what we heard all the time. It's part of the reason that Labour members trusted him. The promise was he was going to sell left-wing politics to people with that package, with that kind of, responsible, sensible, professional sort of appearance. And with that in mind, the whole point of him is that he can sell our preferred version of patriotism and the family and all those traditional concepts and redefine them, because his image is basically not too challenging to people who might otherwise have been turned off by, the kind of the brown suit and whatever else that the media criticised Corbyn for. I think that aspect of Keir Starmer is not being exploited enough or recognised enough by the people around him.
I mean, Sienna, do you think there's worry at the top at the moment in the Parliamentary Labour Party? Because we can see commentators looking nervous. Is there a bit of nervousness at the moment, a lack of direction?
I think there is definitely on the backbenches. I mean, certainly the left are obviously going to be very critical. I think there are others who aren't, haven't been promoted, haven't got another role, and some of them are quite nervous. I mean, shadow cabinet members, it's a real mix. A lot of them are quite defensive when you talk to them about it. I think there is a huge amount of goodwill towards Keir Starmer in the PLP. I mean, let's be frank, like in the leadership election, he did something quite incredible, such a disunited party. He actually brought together a majority of MPs and a majority of members together behind his leadership campaign. That was like a huge thing to be able to do when the Labour Party is so divided. Obviously, that is no longer the case. I think we can safely say that, I mean, that sort of atmosphere of party unity and not wanting to criticize each other that came about during that leadership election is just not there anymore, because everyone is just waging war on each other. But yeah, I mean, I think there's this huge amount of goodwill, and MPs kind of want to trust him, and they want to trust, he will explain it, or leader's office will explain it as, he sees his leadership in stages. Phase 1, constructive opposition. He's introducing himself to the public favourably. He projects this feeling of competence and change from the last leadership with that under new management and new leadership stuff. And he shows that he's in listening mode. And then phase 2 would be starting to set out Labour's vision. And it kind of started last month, but it doesn't seem to have continued much. I mean, he gave this speech sort of starting to do that, but it hasn't really gone ahead. But I think people, in the PLP certainly want to trust him. Obviously, with members, they don't have that kind of personal relationship with him, and it's a different matter.
Flags and patriotism. Now, it was recently revealed by my colleague Ditya Chakraborty in The Guardian, who's a fantastic journalist who everyone needs to really needs to follow and to read. Here we go. This was a strategy document which was from an outside agency, and basically it suggests that they need to lean in on issues like flags, for example. Now, there is, I just want to talk about this because there is this myth actually that Jeremy Corbyn himself never spoke about patriotism, and that isn't actually true. Now, for example, here's a tweet from the general election campaign in 2019, in which he said, patriotism is about supporting each other and not attacking somebody else. It's about loving your country enough to make it a place where nobody's homeless or hungry, held back or left behind. What I would say there is that's actually redefining patriotism from the left. That's saying there's nothing more patriotic than wanting to rid your country of injustice. If you truly love your country, then you want everybody to be free of poverty and injustice. And there's another way of looking at it as well, where you could talk about those who struggled throughout our history, whether those who fought for women's rights, those who fought for the welfare state, those who fought the Nazis, the courage and determination. You could say that's patriotism. I suppose the danger with what we're hearing at the moment is it actually, I mean, in a sense, fill your boots. If you want to put flags behind you all the time, and we can see that everything Labour does at the moment is a Union Jack. I'm a bit like, do what you want. To me, I think the issue is it comes across as very inauthentic because, to be brutally honest, the people at the top of the Labour Party are largely middle-class metropolitan Remainers. They're people who led the charge to Remain. So, and it comes across as cosplay. There's this GIF, which is from a Steve Buscemi sketch where he dresses up as a school kid and goes into a school and goes, "Hello, fellow kids." And it comes across as the patriotism version of, them lot, they like flags, don't they? So we'll just do lots of flags. And the problem with that, and as I've said, I'm not, because I know they want to pigeonhole, lefties, they hate, you're out of touch, look how out of touch you are. People are very positive about the flag in this country. What I'm more concerned about is it comes across as inauthentic symbolism as a substitute for a coherent vision for the country. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, I think there's two things. I think for Labour members, I think there is one, a sense that he hasn't stuck to his 10 pledges. We haven't heard enough about them. And therefore, his kind of retreat into, well, let's just wave the flag, looks like, it feels like a retreat into let's just wave the flag and forget about policy to some people. That might be unfair. I think the other fear that people have got is a kind of retreat back into the kind of Ed Miliband era, where there was a lot of stuff about immigration that was very negative, about, migrants shouldn't be able to claim benefits. We were wrong to have freedom of movement of the accession countries. This kind of always kind of mea culpa that we got it wrong on migration under New Labour, that sort of stuff. And I think that worry, controls on immigration mugs, and that's, ridiculous tombstone behind him. And, I think Stuart Lee, who you had on recently, put it best, it was done with all the commitment of a dog walking away from its own fart. It was that slightly kind of, I don't really mean this, but I have to say it, even though I feel a bit dirty saying it. And there is that kind of risk of inauthenticity. But I think the bigger problem there is that it turns into a more reactionary politics that goes alongside the right's dominant frame of what the flag and patriotism and nationalism means. And people are worried about that. And a lot of people who joined the party under Jeremy Corbyn, and indeed probably under Keir Starmer, are very internationalist. I hope you noticed the symbolic globe behind me rather than the Union Jack. They want a party that isn't kind of inward looking. And there's also the point about Scotland. Does the Union Jack go down well with the people and the seats we need to win in Scotland? And it's very difficult to get a majority without winning something back in Scotland. Mm-hmm. So there are tactical kind of issues about it. There are kind of party members' concerns about it, and then there are policy concerns about where it might lead us if this is a big focus. And I think all of those things are legitimate concerns about it. But inherently, I think there is a way of doing it that's not negative. I mean, actually, Jeremy Corbyn as well as that tweet in the 2019 campaign, but in 2017, in the summer of 2017, after the election result, one of the campaigns we ran was Build It in Britain, about rebuilding Britain's manufacturing infrastructure, targeting those kind of left behind areas that Boris Johnson has now committed to level up. And it was about saying, why is it that we are outsourcing all of our manufacturing to other countries when we have the skills here and jobs are going in manufacturing? So there, it's not inherently wrong to talk about the nation or to symbolize things using the flag or whatever, carefully done. But I think there's the reason there's been a big backlash about this since Dieter's article is what it might lead to and what it has led to in the past under Labour in opposition.
What do you think, Sienna? I mean, this is something people want to know about. Alex Wentworth Wood, what is your view on the Union Jack patriotism stance? I mean, what do you think? Do you think the danger is it's just that inauthenticity point of people who don't actually themselves, this is not something that comes from their heart. They're just looking at a focus group and a poll and that will come across.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with the left talking about patriotism. I mean, I'm half French. Used to that in France, the left talks about patriotism all the time and it's very comfortable with using the flag. In fact, maybe it's even more associated with the left as kind of revolutionary sentiment. It's obviously different here. But I think, we published a comment piece on LabourList recently that argued that red wall voters, they don't want vision, they want competence, and they want a leader who shares their values, is competent, and loves and respects this country. And that, I think, does represent a strand of thinking in the leader's office among his aides, probably a stronger version of how they would put it. But the piece basically argued that, ordinary people out there are very forgiving of the government. And Keir Starmer, it's not about this big vision. He just needs to just kind of convey a sense of being on their side. I think there's lots of risks in that. And I think the best thing, certainly in the slightly longer term for the left, would be for Keir Starmer to define these things in the way that, what does this mean to him? A lot of the time they're not answering that question. And they're kind of, a lot of the time they do things and then they sort of don't own up to them. I mean, for instance, in the kind of huddle with lobby journalists this week, we get once a week after PMQs, we get to ask the Prime Minister spokesman, but also the Labour leader's spokesperson questions, and they have to answer them, and it's on a call with everyone. And sometimes, a lot of it is trying to avoid answering the question. So we asked him about this strategy document, and the spokesperson said, Keir believes in our union of the United Kingdom. The flag represents that union. It's also the wider point of how we are better together. That doesn't mean all that much. Also said the union flag represents the country that Labour wants to govern and that Keir wants to be the PM of. It's a symbol of the country we want to lead. You can call that patriotism. You call it whatever you want, but that's what we stand for. To me, that seems it just sounds a bit non-committal. If you're going for the patriotism thing, go for it full pelt and tell us exactly what you mean by it. I think that would be a better approach.
Just on the COVID response, let's talk about that. We are in the midst of the worst national catastrophe since World War II. Well over 100,000 people now have died. We're heading towards 1 in every 500 people having died in the course of this pandemic. As I've said, one of the worst death rates on the face of the earth. Now, the Tories actually have a polling lead. And it is actually, at the moment, the polling is diverging. If we look at what the public think, people are blaming the public for the increase in infections. The general population, 58% blame the public for the increase in infections compared to 29% blaming the government. So what's obviously set in as a common sense is there's a disaster that's taken place and the government may have made mistakes, but actually a lot of the fault lays with the public. But they don't mean themselves, because the polling also shows that the vast majority of people correctly think it's huge sacrifice. They've abided by very strict measures in order to protect the NHS and save people from dying. Now, to what extent have Labour got this wrong? Because obviously one school of thought goes like this. You don't attack the pilot when the plane is crashing. That's what the public sentiment becomes in a national emergency. But equally, you know, if we look at World War II, actually, in that war, it wasn't the case. I mean, they did actually get rid of the prime minister 10 months in. People forget that, after he completely cocked up the war effort, having led appeasement, and then Norway fell. So people keep going, oh, I wonder what the armchair warriors would be doing in World War II, deposing the prime minister 10 months into the war, probably. But the Labour did say, when we win the war, now we need to win the peace, and this is what the peace is going to look like. We're uniquely placed to win that peace. And the injustices exposed by the war, which led William Beveridge to lay the foundations for the welfare state, for example, we're uniquely placed to fix them. So I suppose my first point is, do you think they've failed to pin the pandemic disaster on the government, or did they not really have a choice without looking, whatever people like me think, like they're politicising a disaster? What do you think, Andrew?
I think it would have been wrong to go in too hard during the first lockdown. I think they could have made slightly more of the lack of support, especially in care homes. I think that's a disgrace. When you talked about, I think it's 1 in 600 or 700 of us have died in the UK. It's about 1 in 20 in care homes have died from COVID. I mean, it's astonishing numbers. I mean, it might even be lower than that now.
It was 1 in 13 by last June.
1 in 13. My God.
1 in 13 in the first 3 months in care homes died of COVID.
Right. Wow, I didn't realise it was that high. But even so, I mean, it's a very big number, and I think they could have gone in a lot stronger on that. Because I think people do realise that care homes are very vulnerable. The people in them are sympathetic. I think there's a lot more sympathy for care home workers as well now. So they could have gone in harder on that. Then it comes back to the other point I made earlier. I think in September, when it was clear the Prime Minister had diverged from Sage and then had to backtrack on it, and in that intervening period, Keir Starmer actually was very, very good, to give him his due, and said, why aren't you following the science? This is what you should be doing. You should be locking down. He called for a lockdown. Johnson dismissed it at PMQs. A week later, he was forced into it because the numbers did keep rising, as Sage had predicted 2 or 3 weeks prior. He then didn't follow that through. He didn't stick with that, follow the science. Here's where, you've made a mess of things, Boris Johnson, because you weren't following the science. And yet he didn't follow up on that. And to me, he gave himself the space. He got respect for doing that. It was the right call. I didn't really hear any dissent about Keir from doing that, just because, how could you? The Prime Minister has just done what he called for. And yet in December, when we saw the Sage minutes in, I think it was about the 21st of December, which said, even with the strength of lockdown we had in the first lockdown, i.e. schools closed as well, we're not sure the numbers will come down unless there are further measures. Keir Starmer went, well, we must have the schools open in January. It was, no. Look, the scientists are saying even that may not be enough. You need to come out and do exactly the same as you did before successfully. From a public health point of view, I'm not talking about the politics of it or the, getting a win out of it. It was the right call in an emergency, in a national crisis. And here you are, Keir Starmer, technocratic, competent, listens to experts, doesn't listen to the experts. And that, to me, was just a point where I thought, it's just frustrating. It's not political, it's not ideological. It's just, this is the brand you built for yourself and you're undermining it. And I don't know if anybody else has a theory on this, but I don't understand what this obsession is with opening the schools all the time. Like, I want schools open. I've got a son. Like, I want him back at school, right? I am not a great teacher and good at homeschooling. Thankfully, in this lockdown, they're much set up with Zoom and and Seesaw for parents who are watching. But it's not the biggest issue at the moment. The biggest issue is we save lives, and to get this wrong, in December, I thought it was a really bad mistake. I mean, obviously, it was hidden by the fact that the Prime Minister made a massive mistake and U-turned on it. but he could have been in that position of strength again, and he wasn't. And I know from conversations I've had that members of the shadow cabinet were tearing their hair out that he wasn't doing this. So there was dissent in this, saying, thinking, why aren't you doing this? And he was getting. I don't know who was pulling him in the opposite direction. That I think is the mystery for me. But I don't know if Sienna or yourself, Owen, have got a theory on that.
What do you think, Sienna? I mean, in terms of, that was a really striking example when baffling that the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, when it was, the polling showed the public thought schools should close, the teachers thought the schools should close, the experts thought the schools should close. The government were clearly going to end up doing it anyway, and then a few hours before the government did it, Labour had to U-turn. I suppose the issue is when the Tories at the moment are going on opportunistic and Captain Hindsight, and the reason they're doing that themselves is they think it cuts through. They think it's cutting through in their focus groups and their polling. And I don't know, is the danger that because Labour don't have a story about the pandemic and how the government messed it up so badly, it does look like they're being opportunistic because all you then have is tactics. And if you only have short-term tactics rather than a story, you do kind of look a bit opportunistic.
I think, I completely agree with Andrew on the schools thing. I wrote a piece for The Guardian, like a very, not my usual sort of analysis piece of what's happening in Labour, but actually just a COP MPs being like, why the fuck didn't you listen to trade unions? Sorry, I don't know whether I was allowed to swear in this podcast. But just, unions are the experts. They were voicing this, but also, literally everyone agreed that this was the right policy and it was inevitable. I can tell you exactly what the people around him were saying in response to this kind of criticism. They said the reality is that we weren't going to call for school closures and let the PM off the hook for putting no plans in place for families who are now stuck at home with no end in sight. It's easy for people who are currently saving money as they work from home. This is obviously a bit of a dig at me, but anyway, to forget the millions of people can't just switch to working on Zoom or take time off when their kids aren't in school. Blah, blah, blah. So this was their kind of response to that sort of criticism. I think from what I understand, it very much came from Keir Starmer himself. It was nobody pulling him in the opposite direction. This was his very strong personal view on schools. The other thing I'd say is that I really strongly agree with what Chris was saying earlier, which is it's about the narrative. I think from the beginning, from April, should have been going in there with this narrative that, they're sort of touching on it now because they talk about economic resilience, but really should have been talking about actually what the unions are talking about at the moment is not just going back to normal, but also we weren't prepared for this. And I think Annalisa Dodds is slightly going for that, but it's not across all briefs at the moment. It's not totally coming out from Keir himself either. I think that would be the narrative it's not about criticising the government's handling of COVID during the pandemic in itself. And that's kind of what he's used PMQs to do. Every week it's ripping apart exactly what the government is doing and how they're handling various aspects of test and trace and blah, blah. And that's the response that people then go, oh, but this is unprecedented, give the guy a break, Boris, such a jolly chap and whatever. But actually what would cut through a lot more is saying, look at the kind of state our NHS was in, look how many beds there were before the pandemic hit us, all of that sort of stuff. I think that would be much better. And I think in terms of being, constructive opposition, being responsible, all of that stuff, I think it comes across as a lot more constructive if you have ideas yourself, if you're actually presenting alternatives. For instance, recently, Labour, slightly, Kate Green has been talking about, Nightingale schools, actually places that are a lot bigger and where you can have ventilation. That's the kind of idea that people want to hear. And people can't criticise you for that. People can't say, oh, well, you just sound sour and overly critical in an unprecedented crisis. That's the kind of thing that actually is constructive opposition. And it's the kind of thing they need to be talking about a lot more.
Just finally, factional stuff. Now we've got the Ford inquiry, which for those who aren't aware of, it was following the leaked Labour report, which exposed some pretty shocking allegations, including about how Labour officials and allegedly actively sought to undermine the elected leadership of the Labour Party and said some horrifying things, particularly against black Labour MPs, it should be said. Now, some of the suspensions have been lifted before the Ford inquiry is reported of those staff who were named in the report. there have been suspensions of party members for example, suggesting votes of no confidence in the General Secretary and in the leader of the Labour Party. The community organising unit, which was something which certainly Jeremy Corbyn was very passionate about, but also his predecessors spoke about doing community organising. David Miliband famously really leaned into that. Stella Creasy, that was a big thing of hers. David Miliband in his 2010 leadership election, that was his big thing. Stella Creasy always went on about it. And it has been briefed in a kind of to Gabriel Pogrund, who's very well connected Sunday Times journalist, that it was, we're getting rid of the Corbynistas. So it wasn't actually about the merits of community organising. It was a factional move. So I suppose my question is, is because those, at the top, they make it clear, well, actually our priority is getting rid of anti-Semitism, not being factional about the left. And obviously anti-Semitism is something that has to be dealt with. But, and I don't mean but in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism, let me make that clear. Anti-Semitism has to be dealt with. As a separate issue, talk of no confidence in the leader of the Labour Party isn't to do with that. And the community organising unit clearly isn't either. So, Andrew, what do you think is happening? Oh, Andrew, we can't hear you at all. Oh, you're muted. That's why. 1 second. Let me...
Sorry.
You are.
I think the biggest failure of Keir Starmer, what he promised in his leadership election to what he's delivered, is on this unity thing. I think a lot of people, I voted for Rebecca Long-Bailey, but I was prepared to give Keir Starmer a chance. I could see the attraction that he had for a number of people on the left, people who had voted for Jeremy Corbyn in 2015 and 2016, clearly in their tens of thousands voted for Keir Starmer because they were told you'll get roughly the same policies. It might be a slight wheeling back into a bit more social democratic thing, but to be honest, that would be a step forward from where we were before Jeremy Corbyn. I think a lot of people accepted that kind of compromise. But he also promised unity, and that was kind of the biggest theme of his election campaign. And he has failed, utterly failed. And maybe it's not him, but ultimately he's the leader, he's responsible. The party has been as factional as ever I can remember, and I've been a member for 25 years. It is so appalling how, what are we, 50 to 70 CLP secretaries and chairs are suspended from the party for putting down motions. Not that anybody is saying anything in the motion itself is offensive, for hearing those motions, for hearing the debate, and it's just ridiculous. The suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, let's take an example. And you talked about the people who've just been readmitted, who were the subject of the Ford inquiry to some extent. When Jeremy Corbyn was readmitted, you had Labour spokespeople in the media saying, "Oh, this is a politicised panel." Well, that same politicised panel has just readmitted all the people who carried out quite horrific abuse against, as you say, black members of the Labour Party, people with mental health issues, in quite shocking terms. Wishing people got set fire to, calling people quite juvenile, pathetic names. And this is in a workplace. This is staff. This is people who are funded by members' wages doing this, acting really factionally. And they've all just been let in, with one exception, Patrick Hennigan. And I'm not somebody who would normally leap to Patrick Hennigan's defence, I have to say. But so it's reported anyway. His boss was Ian McNicol. I assume he's back in. I don't know if he's got the whip back in the Lords. But it's quite absurd that the person who managed him is less culpable than. It seems like he's being thrown under the bus a bit unfairly. I want probably more people thrown under the bus with him, I suppose. But it does seem a bit unfair that he's been singled out. It's hypocritical and it's double standards with what the party leadership has said about Jeremy Corbyn and the NEC disputes panel. The whip not being restored is ridiculous. It just creates fractional divide. It means, I think, Labour's got a more divided party than it has been, I think, for quite a while. Clearly, it was quite divided under Corbyn for a long time, and all of that was our making. That's not a mea culpa at all, because I think the way Corbyn was treated from the very off was appallingly divisive by the PLP. Straight away refused to accept his leadership in many ways, and his own shadow cabinet, who he reached out to in that first period. So I think probably the most depressing failure is, and it does come down to Keir Starmer. He's the person in charge. He got his pick of General Secretary. He's got a majority on the NEC. He's appointed his own shadow cabinet without any of the kind of restrictions that Jeremy had on him straight away. And yet he is, the party is behaving in a more factional way, as I say, than I can probably ever remember in 25 years. And that is really, really poor. And I think unless that gets sorted out, it will affect Labour's electoral chances, because often in parties, the CLP chair, the CLP secretary have a lot of respect locally. If they're not able to go out and campaign, if they're not able to go and mobilise members to go and campaign, that will hit Labour's electoral chances if indeed we do have elections in May. So this is something, regardless of whether you might want to purge the left or not, it's going to undermine the party overall and undermine Keir Starmer's chances of success. And it's also just aesthetically factional and sectarian, and that's the exact opposite of what Keir Starmer promised. So it's crap, really.
Finally, Sienna, what do you think? Is it just a factional offensive?
I think so. On the community organising unit stuff, my understanding is that it has been scrapped altogether. And someone who worked at the unit before said that they wrote a paper actually about how the party needed to adopt community organising and change the way that the whole party organises, and that was agreed by David Evans, the General Secretary, but that doesn't seem to be honoured. I was a commissioner in the Labour Together election review as well, and that really came out strongly in favour of community organising as something very important that the party concentrates on. And I think a lot of the time the discussion is about, oh, well, how much did it make a difference in these seats in 2019, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's being defended as well as effective in the short term. That's kind of all missing the point. I mean, it was about long-term relationships and trust, building that trust with voters. And that's what Keir Starmer says that he most wants to do, and that he recognises, it's a long mountain to climb and all that stuff. And that you can argue that work should be done by volunteers and activists, but obviously you need an enthused membership for that at the same time. So I think, and there's obviously the issue of making people, jobless during a pandemic. So all of that stuff is quite depressing, and quite sort of interesting, considering that, Ed Miliband, who is a very strong proponent of it, is in the shadow cabinet. On the broader factional stuff, if you talk to the leadership, people around the leadership, and if you talk to the Jewish Labour movement, they see all of this as being connected, obviously, very strongly with the EHRC report and what was revealed there. And obviously it found the party responsible for unlawful acts. They couldn't have actually found anything more serious than that. And they see this very much as something, it's actually a moment in the Labour Party's history where you have to think who should be a member of this party and who shouldn't be. That's how they see it. They don't see it as waging a factional war. When you see stories, for instance, we did one this week about how people were suspended after just tabling a motion of no confidence in the leader and the General Secretary, and then withdrawing it once updated guidance was sent out, and then a month later being suspended for originally proposing that motion, even though it was withdrawn, and they say it was never debated. The agenda was updated and all members were told about that. There's a question of application of rules and fairness there, just basic fairness.
Sienna and Andrew, thank you so much. We've covered a huge amount of ground, a real tour de force on Keir Starmer-ism. This is a discussion which will keep on going. So, but it was really, really great. And Sienna, it's great to see your Christmas tree still there. That cheered me up.
No, sorry, that's really sad, isn't it?
No.
I've got a fairy on it as well.
I absolutely love it. I think given the situation we're in, anything to just cheer things up. Great. Exactly. But really appreciate it. Thanks so much for taking your time out, and I will see you both soon.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks everyone. I should just give a little shout out to those who have submitted questions and supported us. Alex Wentworth, Wood, Rajia, Squiddle, Max McDonough, Lawrence Coldrick, also Lynn Haywood, he says, socialism is going global, time to join Progressive International. Do look up, by the way, the Progressive International stuff. That was very, very interesting, everyone. And I think this is a discussion which will keep going, and we'll keep having a range of guests to discuss Labour, the left. Join us on Sunday at 5 o'clock. We'll have a really interesting discussion. I'll work out what. We'll get a couple of very, again, excellent guests. They're always very, very excellent. If you've not downloaded the podcast, just look up the Owen Jones podcast on Spotify or iTunes or Amazon, or don't use Amazon. Use iTunes or something. I mean, they're all corporate titans, but we'll be regularly doing the podcast, including stuff that's exclusive to the podcast. So do get stuck in. As I said, we're in the top 10 nationally and number 1 for news and politics, which I keep bragging about, but it's great. And please do like the video. That helps support the channel. Please subscribe. Just press subscription and the notification bell. We really appreciate your support, including on patreon.com/OwenJones84. That allows us to expand and take over the world. But we've got loads of interviews coming up. Loads of discussions with guests from all over the world about every possible issue there is. So we are looking forward to a great February with a lot of very good content. Hope you're taking care of yourself, and I will see you on Sunday at 5 o'clock.